Stephen Castle, nice to have you here. London correspondent for the New York Times. Is it difficult to explain Britain to your American readers?
Sometimes it is very difficult to explain parts of Britain to American readers. I think there's a lot of familiarity with the country in general, and the United States. There's a lot of interest in the United Kingdom. But there are some things that are very different in Britain to the United States. And one of the interesting things as a journalist is reporting on your own country. I'd actually reported from abroad. I'd been to Brussels, spent a number of years reporting from around Europe, based in Brussels, before I went back to the UK. And that was an interesting preparation and a useful preparation, because when you go back to your own country, having lived abroad, I think you do get a slightly different insight, and that prepares you just to explain to non-British readers some of the peculiarities and some of the very interesting differences between the US and the UK.
Different but not too exotic, is that?
It's not too exotic. I mean, that's one of our issues, that it is a country with which a lot of Americans are very familiar. But at the same time, you know, if you go to the outer reaches of Scotland, can be quite exotic, Cornwall or some of the far reaches. I think Americans are familiar with some parts of Britain on the tourist trail, but the inner cities, some of the more left behind towns like Hartlepool, these are places that Americans would or other tourists would really not very often go. And in fact, a lot of Britons from the south of the country wouldn't go to.
Let's start with the recent riots in Southport and other cities. They were rather nasty. Are they the recurring British riots, or is it part of a more general European unrest?
I think, to be honest, they took most people by surprise. The last time there were riots in Britain were in 2011, and these were prompted or spurred, the pretext anyway, was the tragic murder of 3 girls at a dance class in Southport. I think what we saw was a kind of rather strange episode of rioting, because there didn't seem to be one single far-right group that was orchestrating this. But what was different from 2011 is that social media was obviously much more active and much more powerful in this context. So while there was no sort of real organizing force, that was a sort of help, I think, to the authorities, because on one occasion, on one Wednesday night in the middle of the week, when people were expecting a lot of disturbances, actually very little happened. I think it was a sort of crisis, actually, which for the Prime Minister, I mean, it was a big moment, but it sort of played to one of his strengths, because he's a former chief prosecutor and he'd been in charge of the prosecution service in 2011 when those previous riots had happened. And he had a strategy for tackling them.
Would you say this is about race or about class or maybe something else?
I think it's very difficult to pin precise sources on it. I think what you can say, though, is that it was an expression of the social tensions in Britain that have built up in the last few years. We've had a cost of living crisis, of course. We've had fraying of public services. You know, health services is in a difficult situation. 6 million people on waiting lists for treatment. And of course, there's been a big rise in immigration. There's been a lot of asylum claims, people arriving on small boats. Now, you know, were any of those single things the cause or the pretext? Not clear, but they were certainly used by some people on the far right to motivate people to come out onto the streets and to justify.
Is the far right rising in Britain as it is on continental Europe?
Well, it depends what you mean by the far right. Actually, the real far right are pretty non-existent. What we saw in the last general election was a surprising degree of support for Reform UK, which is the party now led by Nigel Farage, former leader of the Brexit Party and of the UK Independence Party. Now that Britain is out of the EU, he's focusing on immigration as an issue. And although it was very unclear he was even going to run in this election until very late on, his party won 14% of the vote, which is quite a big number for a party that nobody had ever heard of a few years ago. So there's a clear threat to the existing two parties from a more populist right-wing party, Reform UK. If it can get its act together, it's still far from clear it will be able to do that.
Let's talk about the recent election. Can I ask this way, did the Labour win or did the Tories lose?
Both. I mean, it was a curious election, as you say. Keir Starmer has a majority of 170, which is a big majority. That's almost as many as Tony Blair won in 1997.
Was this proof of distrust in the Conservatives?
Yes, but what share of the vote did he win? He won 34% of the vote. Now, even in Britain, that's a very low share of the vote for which to form a government, let alone a landslide victory. I mean, if you compare that with Tony Blair, he won 43% of the vote in 1997. Boris Johnson won 43% of the vote in 2019. And I think it was the frustration of the voters, a desire to get the Conservative Party out, a rather exhausted, divided Conservative Party. They've been in power one way or another for 14 years. Not a lot has gone particularly well in that period. And I think it was the desire to get the Conservative Party out that helped Starmer to this very, very broad but extremely shallow victory.
Starmer himself says that Britain voted decisively for change, for national renewal. Do you think that was the driving force behind?
I think they voted for change in the sense that they wanted to get rid of the Conservative Party, and they managed to do so. In many respects, they voted for other parties if they were better placed to defeat the Conservatives. The centrist Liberal Democrats did extremely well. But I think actually that slogan is coming back a little bit to haunt Keir Starmer, because when he asked people to support him and promised them change, I think most people assumed that he meant change for the better. And more recently, he started to say, well, actually, hold on a minute, things are going to get worse before they get better. And I think that's a slightly challenging message for him. And he's going to have one or two difficulties along the road if he, as he takes some tough decisions.
I'm practicing to pronounce the new ideology miserablism.
Yes.
Is that correct? Is that a general mood in the Labour Party, that things are really bad and it will take a long time before things get better?
Yes, there is a mood of that. Of course, this wasn't quite what the Labour Party was saying when it was campaigning. And I think their argument now is that they've come in, they've looked at the books, they've studied all the detail, and my goodness, things are much worse than we thought. I think that's credible up to a point. There are some areas, for example, prisons. Prisons are overflowing, and the government had to announce very early on that it was going to release some prisoners, non-violent prisoners, early in order to shore up places. I don't think they knew that was coming. But in terms of the general picture, the big picture on taxes and spending, the Labour Party, before the election, signed up to the government's spending plans that were widely regarded as at the time as hugely, heroically over-optimistic, really rather unreasonable. And the Labour Party signed up to those plans. Why did it do that? It did that because it wanted to convince floating voters, undecided voters, that it wasn't going to be profligate in power, that it wasn't going to put up taxes in order to fund a reconstruction of the public services like health, which are in trouble. And now, having ruled out raises in the three main taxes that most people pay, income tax, VAT, and national insurance, the government's in a bit of a quandary. And its answer is to say, oh, our inheritance is so terrible, but it's constrained by some of the pledges that it's already given.
Were you surprised that the Prime Minister delivered this message of blood, sweat and tears rather than showing us the bright future that's awaiting at the end of the Labour first government?
Well, it was a bit of expectation management because we have a budget coming up at the end of October, and in that budget there are going to have to be some tough decisions. And I think it's a way of trying to get out of this tangle that the Labour Party, to an extent, has got itself into by signing up to public spending plans announced by the Conservatives, which I think everybody knew were not realistic. So it's trying to say, okay, it's going to be worse than we thought. It's going to be tougher than we thought. But it's blame the Conservatives. Now, is that going to work?
Does it work?
Well, I'm not sure it is going to work quite as smoothly as the government thinks. And, you know, there are one or two signs of a bit of a backlash. So, but one measure which has caused something of a backlash, certainly within the Labour Party, is a decision by the government, as already announced it, to restrict winter fuel payments. These are subsidies given to all old age pensioners, and it said it's going to limit those. And that's caused a bit of a backlash. Well, the government's saying, well, you guessed it, it's the fault of the Conservatives. They left us with this terrible inheritance.
It does,
but at the same time, it's taken other decisions. For example, it's given pay rises to public sector workers who were threatening to go on strike. So it's critics are saying, okay, but you chose to do this thing, but you didn't. You chose to also scrap the winter fuel payments. And to govern is obviously to choose. And I think this government is going to have to defend its decisions. And I think that's where it's slightly realising that it's maybe got a big task on its hands.
Does Starmer have a united Labour Party behind him? I read that Jeremy Corbyn is forming a new group in Parliament.
I mean, Jeremy Corbyn is no longer a part of the Labour Party, but he was re-elected as an independent. He was purged under Keir Starmer, quite a dramatic act to purge your predecessor. And there are a number
But does he have a sway on the electorate still?
Well, I think the group that he's trying to form are a small number of independents who were elected really in opposition to the government's policies on Gaza. And I think there is a pressure point there. I think the broader point is Starmer has a majority of 170. That's a huge number. And I think at this moment...
And this majority, is it united behind Starmer? We're with you.
At the moment, it's pretty united. There was one rebellion earlier, almost immediately after the election. And the Starmer was, in keeping with his previous practice, very ruthless, suspending a few members of the party. So I think he's not going to brook any ill discipline. And I think we are at a phase where, you know, the Conservatives, after 14 years, were pretty divided. Their government was rather exhausted, if you like. A lot of personal animosity there. Labour's come in. It hasn't been in power since, 2010. So there's a certain amount of enthusiasm. There's a lot of desire to get going. And there is a sort of unity of purpose at the moment for the vast majority of the Labour Party. How long that lasts is, of course, a difficult question.
Can Starmer channel this enthusiasm? He seems to be quite a low-key person, not a very deft traditional politician, rather a sort of manager of the government. Is he a good leader, in short?
I mean, unproven. What he has been was a fantastically successful leader of the opposition. You have to remember he came into power in 2020 after the worst defeat Labour had since 1935, a landslide for Boris Johnson. At that moment, almost no one thought that the Labour had a chance of winning the next election in 2024, let alone achieving a landslide. And so what he's done at that level has been pretty remarkable. But you make a good point, which is that he's not really a retail politician. It's not really a coincidence that he and Boris Johnson really disliked each other, because they're, in a sense, polar opposites. Boris Johnson, great campaigner, tremendous phrase maker, great jokes. When Boris Johnson was making a speech, you'd always look forward to it, even if you knew that the content was not going to be great. There'd be something in there. There'd be a phrase, there'd be a joke, there'd be something entertaining. Starmer is none of that. But Boris Johnson was not good on attention to detail, not a long attention span, and proved to be not at all good in government. Starmer is a lawyer by training, very good on the detail, and so far he's been low-key, he's been competent, but he looks like he could be an effective Prime Minister at a managerial level. His challenge, as you say, is to give people a narrative, to sell himself, to sell the party.
The Chancellor, Susan Reeve, said, "We will end the era of noisy performance, tread more lightly on your lives and unite our country."
Sounds great,
I mean,
doesn't
if they succeed, it will be quite a great change in this sort of the mood, the atmosphere of politics in Britain.
It would be. It would be a big change. And I think there's a challenge there because you can think of some countries where the electorate tends to embrace a sort of rather dull technocratic leader. Germany, when Angela Merkel comes to mind. At the moment, I think people are a bit exhausted by the dramas of the last few years. Don't forget, Starmer is the 5th Prime Minister we've had since 2016. But there's a very lively political culture in Britain, and low-key politicians don't always tend to prosper. I mean, you think back to the 1990s, John Major won one election when he just become Conservative leader, but rather narrowly, then he went down to a landslide defeat. Theresa May, 2017, she didn't do so well. She was strong and stable, supposedly, but didn't win an election she should easily have won. And then Rishi Sunak, we saw earlier this year, went down to a landslide. So I think one thing you can say is that Starmer really has to deliver, because he can't rely, as perhaps Tony Blair was able to, on charisma, on star quality. He's going to have to deliver.
He went to Germany and met Olaf Scholz, trying to sort of improve the relation between Britain and Germany and the European Union. How far does he want to go?
A very interesting question. I mean, I think we're in what people call phase one of the reset, as he's describing it, of relations with the European Union. And that's really about re-establishing ties, about getting a rapport with other European leaders, about persuading European capitals that after all those dramas of the Brexit years and the Boris Johnson tough negotiating stance, David Frost walking out of meetings, all that sort of thing, that Britain is back as a stable and reliable partner.
But re-entry is not on the agenda.
Well, the difficulty is, I mean, that's the phase one, which is just about being nice to people, and that's the easy part. As you say, the devil is in the detail. What does Labour want to do? Now, Starmer, don't forget, he was a Remainer. He actually wanted to overturn the referendum result. It was part of that campaign. But once it was set in stone, I mean, Starmer, one thing we know about him, he's quite a pragmatist. So before the election, again, he ruled out membership of the customs union, slightly surprisingly, but certainly membership of the single market, let alone rejoining the EU. So what he's looking for are some sort of intermediary steps that will bring Britain a bit closer to the European Union without trampling on those red lines. And I think he's clearly going to offer a security and defence agreement with the EU, which is something the EU wanted in 2019 from Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson didn't want to give that, and that will be welcome on all sides. But if Starmer wants to get any easements, any concessions on trade, which has been quite badly hit by Brexit, then there's not a lot of enthusiasm in Brussels for reopening that discussion. And Starmer's going to have to offer something in return. So that's the discussion.
Will you be offended if I ask you, does Britain matter in Europe and in the world?
Well, I think it does matter in Europe, in the world, partly because it's, in European terms, it's one of the few big defence powers. I mean, it has a defence capability, and I think that's why the European Union really wants that sort of security and defence agreement. So at that level, it's still quite a big economy, and I think it does matter to the European Union what Britain does, because it's a big economy on its doorstep. And I think it actually is in the European Union's interest to stabilise that relationship, because what you saw in the Brexit years was this idea taking hold on some people on the right of the Conservative Party that the way to do Brexit, the logic of Brexit in economic terms, if there is a logic, is to deregulate, it's to undercut the EU, it's to steal jobs and investment from the EU by cutting standards, by labour standards, by environmental standards, that sort of thing. Singapore on Thames, that's what some people wanted. Now, that's not where it's turned out at the moment, but it would be unfortunate for the EU if some years down the track, depending on what happens in the Conservative Party, another British Prime Minister were to try that. So stabilising that relationship, neutralising ties with the EU, between the EU and Britain, I believe is actually in the EU's interest as well as Britain's.
I must ask you, who is the next Tory leader?
Impossible to say. I mean, it's a very interesting question, very interesting.
If I push you, say, mention you're the most likely one.
Well, let me explain why it's impossible. Because it's a two-stage process. So firstly, the 6 candidates have to be winnowed down to 2. And those 2 candidates will be chosen by members of Parliament. It's a much smaller group, the members of Parliament now, only about 120. So we don't quite know the composition of that. It looks as if they will probably choose one centrist and one more right-wing candidate.
So will the Tory party change under any new leader?
Well, it depends where they go. The final decision is down to members who usually pick the more right-wing of the 2.
Does the Tory party have to change?
Well, what it's undergoing at the moment is a sort of rather existential debate. Do they do what actually Keir Starmer did with the Labour Party after 2019, after that defeat, and move the party back to the centre ground and try and win back those seats, particularly that they lost to the Liberal Democrats? And if you follow that logic, you go for a centrist, someone perhaps like Tom Tugendhat. Or do you align more closely to the populist right? Do you elect perhaps somebody who's got a harder line, maybe Kemi Badenoch? And do you sort of fight Nigel Farage for that terrain, try and win over voters who were traditionally Labour supporters in sort of urban centres but had defected to Nigel Farage's Reform UK party? So I would say it's between those, the most likely poll is between Tom Tugendhat and Kemi Badenoch, but how that turns out, those 2 might not even make it to the final ballot to be chosen by the party members. So it really is impossible. And one way of knowing that it's impossible to predict is that in Tory leadership contests, usually there's a front runner, and then usually a lot of MPs fall behind that front runner because they want to be back the winner. And this time, they don't seem to know.
Mm. You have mentioned Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. Will they still be around in the centre of British politics?
Well,
Boris Johnson does he have ambitions to make a comeback?
Boris Johnson always has ambitions. He's sitting out this contest. He's not in Parliament.
But will he?
I think if he, Boris Johnson models himself on Winston Churchill. I know, probably not the most apposite comparison, but he thinks of himself really in those terms. And Winston Churchill was a great comeback politician. And I think Boris Johnson probably thinks there's one more chapter left in his political saga. Now,
and Nigel Farage, he has been mentioned as a possible future Tory party leader, even.
That threat seems to have dissipated somewhat, threat or prospect rather, because the main leadership contenders now seem to be playing down that prospect. What the person who was most likely to invite him in, Suella Braverman, isn't running to be Tory leader, so she won't be. I think for Farage, the question is whether he can build a credible national party out of Reform UK, which at the moment, it's only really a skeleton structure. In municipal elections, it doesn't do very well. It doesn't do anything like as well as the previous parties that Farage led, Brexit or UKIP, It doesn't have that. So it doesn't have many people sitting on municipalities around the country out campaigning. And I think there's another issue really about Farage, because he's both their strength and their weakness. It is a bit of a one-man band. Farage is not the most disciplined politician, and he tends to fall out with a lot of other members of parties he's led in the past. So whether he can make this into a credible national force is an open question.
Stephen, when you don't write about politics, you write about wild boars destroying the countryside round Loch Ness. What is your next story of the same kind?
Not just wild boars. I'm wondering, as I come to Sweden, I think actually I did write, when I was a Brussels correspondent, a story about wolves in Sweden and how they were threatening the farmers. But I don't have any. I think we're looking now forward to the party conferences.
Yes.
And so it's going to be a busy autumn season or fall season. There's a budget coming out, big decisions for Keir Starmer. So I think that's going to preoccupy me for the next few months, but I'm always on the lookout for a good wildlife story, particularly if it means going to a particularly exotic part of Scotland.
Stephen, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.